I like that Joe brought up that we have the faith of our spiritual fathers. Those are our examples from the times past. But he also mentioned our spiritual mothers, which is very true. We're going to be actually looking at a couple of examples, one in particular, from the Old Testament today, and it's has to do with one of our spiritual examples. In this case, it's an example not to follow, and we're going to learn from that example, and it's very interesting. I think it's a text that's very subtle, and there's a lot of layers to it, and it will be quite interesting. And it has to do with Rachel when she took idols out of her father's house and carried them with her. It's a story we've probably heard before, or it may be one that you have not heard before, but either way, I think it'll be very interesting. And you may wonder, well, how is that relevant? Because in my house, we don't have anything that looks at all like that. And that's probably quite true for all of us. I hope that's true. But we're also going to notice, too, though, that it's not only about those physical things, because it really has to do with a mindset just as much as those physical things that she did. And so we're going to see that it really is more about the human tendency that we have to want to cling on to things that give us a sense of security, like a safety blanket, and gives us some feeling of consistency in our lives. That's what she was after, and I think we're going to see that as we read through the text. So first of all, what is that thing that's in the picture there? That is actually something that in the Bible is called a teraphim. Teraphim. And that's the Hebrew word that is translated in different translations. And I put here that sometimes it's translated in different Bible versions as the version I have, New King James Version, it's called household gods. And this is an interesting word because teraphim it's a plural word in Hebrew. Things that end in im like that are usually plural, but occasionally they can be plural or singular. So when they say teraphim in the Bible, it can be one idol or it can be many idols. It's one of those interesting words. And there's three passages in the Old Testament that I put there where you find a lot of discussion about teraphim, these kinds of idols. Genesis 31 is the one we're going to talk about today. This is when Rachel took those from her father's house as she left and went with her husband. There's also an interesting story in Judges 17 and 18 where a man named Micah had some teraphim as well. And they were stolen, similar to how what Rachel does. So there's the element of stealing that's also present in that story. And then lastly, in 1 Samuel 19, King Saul's daughter, Michal, had teraphim also, and she had those in her house. And this is David's wife. And you see in that example, she stuffs them under some covers, and people think that it's actually David that's under the covers. And it was a deception that she did. But this has something in common with Rachel's in that they were both hidden in some way. So it's kind of interesting to see those threads that are common to all those stories about the teraphim. The other thing that we learned though is that picture there is pretty small. You can see the number there is like there's a number 11 right there in the bottom left because this is on display in the Louvre. Fortunately, this teraphim was not stolen from the Louvre in what recently happened, but Rachel will be stealing it in the story. But you can see the size of that based on that little number. You can tell those are like figurines. Those are pretty small. But the story that you read about in Samuel 19 with Michael, it's a life-size picture, like a life-size image. So apparently there's wide variety in how big these idols are. In the case of Rachel, it appears they're small like this one, and this is a Canaanite idol that you see on display in the Louvre. So it's very small because it's something that she was able to conceal and hide in a small space. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about little figurines that are going to be in the story here. And there's a lot of discrepancy when you read different opinions, a lot of variety in what people think about what they were for. Like, why would you even have one of these things? The things that are mostly brought out when you read about this is inheritance rights. So when it says household gods, it makes you think that this has to do with a household, kind of like people have a coat of arms or something. A lot of people think it was something like that, where these particular figurines represented the inheritance rights. Some people say that it had to do with fertility, and they base that on what the images look like. There's a lot of images of teraphim you can find online that are not safe to put up on a screen like this, and so you can kind of imagine what they're talking about. And thirdly, a lot of people think that it has to do with divine protection, and that's why they're called household gods, because they are seen as divine protectors, kind of like an amulet, or like if you have a lucky rabbit's foot, we tend to call that luck. They would have called this protection of some deity, some divinity. And so there's all these elements that are there that are all possible in the story, and it's hard to tell for sure which ones are enter into this particular story, but there's probably a mixture of all of those things. And just so we understand the context here, very small chart here, I guess, but we have here a picture of Abraham and Sarah, and then their child Isaac, who married Rebekah, and then Isaac's son was Jacob. And remember, they had Jacob and Esau, the two twins. Jacob is the one that has the inheritance, even though he's the second born. And then you see Jacob has children through these four women. First of all, Jacob worked for a man named Laban because he loved Rachel, and it's described as a very beautiful story where he was infatuated with her in the beginning, and he just felt like that had to be his wife. And Laban is a man that was very greedy, I would say, and deceptive, and he basically forced Jacob to work for him for 7 years in order to give him his daughter Rachel. And it says in the story that that he felt like those 7 years were like one day because he loved her so much. So it's a beautiful story. But you know what happened at the end of those 7 years? If you recall the story, he ends up getting married to Leah by deception. And Laban gives the wrong daughter on purpose to him and says, "Here's my daughter. Well, you have to marry her because she's the oldest." And then he says, "But I wanted the younger one." And he says, "Well, you can work for me 7 more years then, and then you can have that one." And so in all, he ends up working 14 years for this man, and he gets married to his two daughters, and especially the one that he really wanted. So this man is somebody that's not part of God's people. He's described as Laban the Syrian, and that's because he had different gods than what Jacob had. You know, Jacob is his God is Jehovah. He's described as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in so many places. But you see that these two people are having this relationship here where there's two different gods at play. And whatever gods Laban had, they were vastly different from the one true God, Jehovah, that was associated with Jacob. And so what you see here is that Laban was really greedy the whole time, but God blessed Jacob because all the time he was working there for Laban, Jacob was becoming prosperous and rich because there were being born all kinds of livestock to Laban and to Jacob, and they were intermingling and everything, but Jacob's was growing by leaps and bounds, whereas Laban's was not. And so God was blessing Jacob. You know, that was the promise. He said he would make a great nation out of Abraham's children, and it's going to come through Jacob because his name will be Israel. And these are the 12 sons of Israel. And so this is a very important family at the time and in all of human history because this is the family through which our Savior is going to descend. So you see, actually, Rachel, one of the things that happens is she's not having any children. And for a long time, you see all these other children being born: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, all those are born. And she still hasn't had any children yet. And so she's wondering, how is that ever going to happen? And so eventually, she gives birth to Joseph, which we all know from the stories about Joseph. And lastly, and after the story that we're going to talk about today, she will give birth to Benjamin, and she will die in childbirth. And so she has fewer children than these other women gave to Jacob. So you can sort of imagine her situation, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. But let's read through the text here in Genesis 31. It's Genesis 31, beginning with verse 19. It says, "Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the household idols that were her father's. And Jacob stole away, unknown to Laban the Syrian, in that he did not tell him he intended to flee. So he fled with all he had. He arose and crossed the river and headed towards the mountains of Gilead. And Laban was told on the third day that Jacob had fled. Then he took his brethren with him and pursued him for 7 days' journey. And he overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. But God had come to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, 'Be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad.'" So what we see going on here is that they were tending sheep and livestock, and while Laban was out in the field taking care of his animals, what we see here is Jacob and Rachel are preparing to leave like very quickly and in an unannounced way. And the reason he's doing that is because Laban had taken advantage of him so many times and tricked him and was deceitful and changed. It says in the text that he changed his wages 10 times as he was working for Laban. So this is not a man of integrity, this Laban. And so Jacob decides it's time to just pull away from this and go back to where he's from and be with Isaac and Rebekah, his parents. And so he's ready to bring his wives back to that. And so he realizes that Laban will not want him to leave. And Laban will do everything to make excuses and say they can't leave. So he decides to just leave. So it says Jacob stole away unknown to Laban the Syrian because he didn't tell. But the other thing that Jacob himself didn't know about is it says Rachel took the household idols that were part of her father's house. And so she had this life where she grew up in her father's religion, her father's culture, and that was deeply ingrained in her, and she didn't want to leave that behind. And so she stole those away from her father and took them as they left. And so when it says Jacob fled with all he had, it's talking about Jacob's own, immense belongings that he had obtained through all the livestock that were born there. So he had a great massive fortune with him, and he left and went back towards his promised land. And so Laban finds out 3 days later, and he goes after him and he tries to track him down because he feels like, oh, he's taken so many things. I need to go find this guy. And he pursued him for 7 days and finally came up to him. But we see God intervenes here because he knows how Laban is a slippery person that wants to go and do things he shouldn't be doing. And Jacob is blessed by God. So God appears to Laban the Syrian in a dream, and this is not even the God that Laban respects. God Laban has his own gods, but the one true God comes to Laban in a dream, and he says, "Be careful what you say to Jacob. Don't say anything. Don't criticize him, and don't say anything good or bad. Just stay away from him." That's basically what God is saying to him, because he's God's chosen individual. So the next verse says, Laban overtook Jacob, and Jacob pitched his tent in the mountains. And Laban with his brethren pitched in the mountains of Gilead. And then in verse 26, Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done, that you have stolen away unknown to me, and carried away my daughters like captives taken with the sword? Why did you flee away secretly, and steal away from me, and not tell me? For I might have sent you away with joy and songs, with timbrel and harp. And you did not allow me to kiss my sons and daughters. Now you have done foolishly in so doing. It's in my power to do you harm. But the God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, 'Be careful that you speak to Jacob neither good nor bad.' And now you have surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you steal my gods?" So this is an interesting passage because Laban actually gets to the place where Jacob is, and he sees Jacob with all his animals, Laban's two daughters, and he comes after him and he says, "Why did you leave like this? Why did you go away secretly? I could have given you a big party. We could have had a great joyous departure and everything would be great. But you just ran off like people that take away captives in a battle, like they're prisoners of war." That's how he's treating him. Now, of course, this is a man who has been completely dishonest with Jacob all the time, and we know that this is mere excuses, and this is just him wanting some of those possessions back that he's apparently, coveting, really. And he's also upset that he took away the daughters without a proper goodbye. And I think we understand why Jacob would do that because so many times he's been tricked. He says, "I've had enough of this. I'm leaving." And so he mentions, "I have the power to do you harm." So Laban is a powerful man still, despite Jacob becoming more powerful. But he mentions that Jehovah God came to him and told him these things. And then he says, "You know what? That's interesting that Jehovah told me this, but why did you take other gods that are not Jehovah?" Now Jacob doesn't know this, right? Because who took them? It wasn't Jacob. It was Rachel that took them. And Jacob was not even aware that she did it. And so right now, this must come as a very strange accusation to Jacob because he's thinking, of all things for me to take from Laban's house that don't belong to me, that is the one thing I would never have taken. So he must be thinking that's completely out of the question and it's a ridiculous accusation. So in verse 31, Jacob answered and said to Laban, "Because I was afraid, for I said, perhaps you would take your daughters from me by force." Just like he did, he reneged on on his agreement with Laban to marry the first daughter, and Laban gave him the wrong one. He didn't trust Laban. With whomever you find your gods, do not let him live. In the presence of our brethren, identify what I have of yours and take it with you. For Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. So basically, Jacob is saying, well, let's go through my stuff then. You can come into my camp. You can go through my tents. We need to have witnesses here, and we'll all look and see what I have. And if I have something that's not mine, then you can have it. And if I have the gods, he says, whoever took them would die. That's what Jacob is saying, because he's so sure that they're not there. And in verse 33, Laban went into Jacob's tent, into Leah's tent, and into the two maids' tents, but he did not find them. Then he went out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. And Rachel had taken the household idols and put them in the camel's saddle and sat on them. And Laban searched all about the tent, but did not find them. And she said to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of women is with me. And he searched, but did not find the household idols. And so we see what happens here is he goes tent to tent, and he goes into the tent of these four women that are with Jacob, that are bearing him children. And one by one, he's looking through all the things to see if there's stolen things there. And he finally comes to Rachel's tent, and she makes a trick to basically say, you can't search my tent because it's not a convenient time for that. And by doing that, of course, he respects that, and the father doesn't go search where she is. And of course, that's exactly where the stolen idols are. So for that reason, she protects those idols, and Laban doesn't find it. And so you see, he says he searched, but he did not find the household idols. So now that's the story of how Laban tried to go and track him down and get his idols back and try to probably get more things back from Jacob as well. But let's analyze this just a little bit. Well, the first thing we see is Rachel steals these idols. But what was she really taking? Why was she doing that? You have to think about what was her purpose here? What was going through her mind? And like we said before, sometimes people think the teraphim symbolized inheritance rights. For inheritance rights, she knew that her father was not a very honest person, and that he loved possessions, and that he loved tricking people and deceiving people and ripping them off, probably. And so she was trying to make sure, probably in her mind, among other things, that she would be a legitimate heir to her father, perhaps. That may be one thing that was going through her mind. Some people believed that they had to do with fertility and guaranteed fertility to the women that had these. Now remember, she was barren and she just had only one child at this point. So she may have thought that that was the reason why she had a child and she wanted to keep having more children. If that's the case, that might have been going through her mind as well too. And lastly, divine protection. We talked about that as a third thing. For divine protection, she may have thought that she's going to be going to a faraway land and she needs the protection that she's grown up with and known all her life with her father's household. So when you think about those things, she was probably looking for some kind of protection, some kind of help in those difficult times because she's going away to an unknown land. She's leaving her family. She doesn't know when she'll see them again, and so she's holding on to things in the past that she shouldn't be holding on to. You also see how she's very undervalued by her father, and how her father basically didn't let her marry the one that she was supposed to marry and tricked her as well as Jacob. That wasn't dealing very fairly with her. She probably feels very exploited by her father because he was just using her to get 14 years of work also out of Jacob. So there's not a very good family relationship there either. And so she probably had something against him as well. And so for whatever reason, she took his idols and she left with them. And so when you think about what's really going on here in her mind is instead of giving herself fully to the God of Jacob as she marries him and goes away to live in that land, she's kind of straddling those two fences because in one sense, she still is holding on to all the things in the past that she thought gave her protection and comfort and security. And she's still also willing to go with her husband and accept whatever protection Jehovah will give her as well too. So she's probably got this dual thing in her mind. What you notice in the New Testament though is you find a case like in Acts chapter 19 when Paul is on his missionary journeys and he goes to the city of Ephesus. And you may recall how it says that they saw all the miracles that Paul did. And when they were baptized and they became Christians, they took all their books that were witchcraft or black arts or whatever we want to call them, And they took them all, piled them up into a heap, and burned them all. And it tells us in Acts that it was a lot of money. It tells us this exact figure of how much that all cost. So here are people that had those things in their past, where they had their trust and confidence in things that were not divine, things that were from another source. And they realized once they saw the divine, once they experienced it, once they became part of God's people, that was enough for them to realize that all of those things from their past had no power. They had no real efficacy for them. They could see that the apostles had great power in the miracles that they were doing, and those idols that they had, and those books, and those beliefs, and everything that was belonged to things that are not of God, they realized it was nothing, and they burned it all. They got rid of it. They didn't carry it with them. They didn't say, well, I'll keep this stuff also. And that's what Rachel didn't do in this case. Rachel was trying to hold on to the past for longer, even as she was being grafted onto God's family through marriage, and she was leaving to go to another place. So Rachel steals, but Rachel also conceals, which is another thing. And so you think about what she was doing there. She was in her tent, and she was hiding them in the camel saddle, which means they were those small idols, those figurines. She put them in some place where they wouldn't be seen. And so she's definitely wanting to hold on to those things, and she doesn't want anybody else to know about it. She doesn't even tell Jacob, doesn't tell anybody. She's the only one that knows about this. And so it's more than just deception, really. This is more about how she is protecting her own past and her own beliefs and her own security blanket, as it were. And she wants to continue with that for as long as possible. So a lot of times we have the same tendencies too in our lives, I believe, because we find things that we hide from others. We have things that we would be embarrassed to say out loud. And those things can sometimes take precedence in our life over our service to God. How many times do we have things like a career, for example, that overshadows our service to God, or relationships we have that trump our relationship with God in some way, or all the things that we think give us comfort and security in life? We hold on to those things dearly when really we should let a lot of those things go, especially if they compete with God in our heart and in our mind. Those are the kind of things that become idols for us, not the little figurines that we're talking about anymore, not the physical images that you carry around with you, but what those represent. All of those things. The New Testament tells us that covetousness is what? Is idolatry. And so there's so many things that can be considered idolatry without having a literal physical idol in your pocket, on your shelf, or in your home somewhere. And so that's the kind of thing, if we conceal those things like Rachel was doing, that's actually just prolonging a period when we're having a dual mind and a dual heart. And it's not letting us fully dedicate ourselves to God. So we ought to make sure that we're not hiding those things from ourselves and from others. But look also in the story about Jacob and his role in this. He had a blind spot here because he really didn't see that she had taken them. And he didn't see her character well enough to understand that she was capable of such a thing. And now we always know that we can't be perfect judges of anybody else. We can't always know what's in someone's heart. But at the same time, he also is responsible for his household and for what's in it. And so he was so sure that there was nothing wrong here that he said whoever took them should just die. He thought it was completely out of the question that that could be somewhere among all those things that they took out of Laban's area. And so Jacob clearly had a blind spot here. And sometimes when we focus too much on our own integrity, our own faithfulness, our own righteousness, our own striving for doing God's will, sometimes we don't see what's right around us. And sometimes we don't try to help others as we should. He should have been a little bit more perceptive, most likely. But he clearly had a blind spot here. And idolatry can very well be hidden inside a household, and a family member or a friend or somebody else that you know can be hiding many things from you, and it's something that we can sometimes be able to be more perceptive about in a way that would help. Also in the story, you see God's mercy as a very important factor here, because here is the family that he's chosen among all other families of the earth, and this is the family through which Jesus Christ is going to come once again. And so you think about why this is so important. That's the reason, because this is how humanity will be saved. And yet we see here that there was such a moment of weakness here in this particular uh, character in our saga here, because she actually didn't trust in Jehovah very much at this point yet. Later it will be different, but at this point she really didn't. And God was not overlooking that. He was actually giving her time and giving patience. And in so doing, that is very merciful because you think about what Jacob had said. He said, whoever did this should die. Jacob was ready to do that, and who knows if he would have carried it out or not if he had found out about it. But he didn't find out. And so God actually protected Jacob and protected her from that by not letting it be revealed at that moment. And he gave her time to deal with it in the right way later. And so what you see is God is being merciful. Not only did he not judge her for doing that immediately, he also protected her life as she was trying to come around to understanding more about Jehovah. And he gave her that time and that patience needed. And that is God's tremendous mercy. And he does that for every one of us because we all have things that we could be guilty of in the same fashion. We all have times in our lives where we've dedicated too much of our life to things that don't matter and things that are really a waste of our time. And those become idols to us. And God doesn't just immediately strike us down and say, well, that's it for you. You made one mistake, goodbye. What he does is he tries to give us that space to correct it and to learn from that and to make sure that we can come back to him because he wants us to be saved in the end. And so what you see later in chapter 35, it's 4 chapters later, there's a household purge in which Jacob calls all of the people in his house and he says, here's what he says in Genesis 35:2. He says, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you and purify yourselves and change your clothes. And so here's Jacob realizing that there are some others that have taken gods, whether they acquired them along the way or whether they were all brought from Laban's house, we don't know for sure, but they had started to accumulate other gods. And so Jacob is saying, get rid of all these things. And he's saying that just before he builds an altar in the promised land, in the city of Bethel. He's about to dedicate his family and his descendants to God as the chosen nation that God has chosen. And yet, he still sees all around there that they have idols. And he says, bring them all here. We're going to get rid of these because now we're in the promised land. We don't need these other things anymore. So it says in verse 4, it says they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. And so when he came into the promised land, he took away all those gods and they just piled them up, like in Ephesus when they burned the books. They piled all these things and they buried them in a place where they would not be unearthed after that point. And so even though it's not specifically mentioned that Rachel's idols were disposed of at that point, that's almost surely when she got rid of them, when other people were getting rid of theirs as well. And it was done in a way where apparently Jacob never found out that she was actually the one that had done it. And so God protected her all that time, and yet they came to a point where she got rid of them. So the secret sin that she had in her heart and in her life is something that never had to be revealed except in the Bible, which we read about now. But those people living apparently never found out about it, and they never knew that she had done that. And yet God was merciful to her and gave her the chance to go and get rid of it, and she did do it. Now, if she had held on to it past that point, that could be a time when God's mercy begins to be exhausted because that was her chance to get rid of it safely when everyone else was doing it and it was easy to do, and apparently she must have done it at that point. And so it really talks about how she put an end, as well as all the other people in the household. She put an end to idolatry and got rid of those as they dedicated themselves to God and made that altar there at Bethel. So in light of all that, we should ask ourselves some questions then. When we feel vulnerable, when we feel insecure in life, what kind of things do we cling to? Because that was her problem. It wasn't so much the physical idol, although that was a problem. It was more, why would she want that? What was in her heart? What was in her mind? Why did she feel like those things would give her power? We can ask ourselves the same question, right? Because when we feel vulnerable, we feel insecure, what are the things where we look to get security? Do we look to money? Do we look to certain relationships with friends? Do we look for position in society or prestige or whatever we may have? Those are the kind of things that people sometimes look to for security, and they really are not very strong foundations. Because really what we need to cling to is God. If we find ourselves vulnerable, God wants us to do what? To meditate on it, to pray, to think about it. That's what God wants from us. But if we go to other areas to try to find that security, and prayer is not our first option, that tells us that we have our heart misplaced. that our trust is in something that's not worthy of our trust, something that really can't benefit us as much as God can. We can also ask ourselves this question: what do I hide from others in my saddlebags? Rachel had this convenient place to stash it, to stash the idols, where no one can find it. And she thought, well, if no one can find it, it can't be a problem. But a lot of times we think that way too, because we have things in our lives that we know we need to fix. We have areas in which we have idols, as it were, things that are more important to us at for a time than God. And we need to acknowledge those things and not hide it from others, not prolong it, not uh not keep secrets from God and from other people. Because if we do that, then we're going to be guilty of the same thing that we saw in this text. So we can ask ourselves also, what fears or attachments do I sit on, even as I journey with God's people? So what did she do? She sat on the idols to protect them, to make sure no one could get them. So the idea here is that not only did she take those idols, she went through great extreme efforts to protect them and keep them going and to persist in having those things that she should not be having. Instead of giving her full faith and trust in God, Jehovah God, she gives part of her faith and trust in these things. And she sits on them, in other words, tries to keep them in her life for as long as possible, keep them hidden and maintain them. And so many times, we might be guilty of the same kind of thing where we know there's something we need to fix, but we let it go on and on and on and on, and we don't fix it. We don't get rid of that idol. And so really it's not much different than what she's doing. And we know that God is gracious not only to her, but he's also been very, very gracious to us because we see the time he's given us to correct our own problems and our own shortcomings, we understand that he is truly, truly a patient God. He wants everyone to be saved in the end. And so that's very true. So we ask ourselves finally then, if we had to purge the idols like they did and just get rid of them, and they buried them under that oak tree, what would we bury under the oak tree? What would it take for anything in our life that's taking precedent over God or anything that even challenges God for first place? What would we do to get rid of those things? What would that look like? Sometimes, if it's a secret thing that's hidden from people, we don't even entertain that question because we think, who cares? But you know what? God cares. God is not, nothing is hidden from God. Everything is open to him, and he knows our hearts, and he knows our minds, and he knows our actions. And so we have to understand that if God can see and hear and believe and understand everything about us, that means there's nothing hidden from him. And if there's nothing hidden, we ought to get rid of those things at the first opportunity. And of course, she did that. She got rid of those things in a very private way, most likely, where it wasn't obvious that she ever did the thing. And you know what? That's good enough. If you have private sins that you've committed against God and you repent privately and become clean with God and get forgiven by God, that's good enough. There's no reason to go and announce those things. So whatever the case is in our lives, we ought to dedicate ourselves day after day and think about what vies for our attention, what vies for our thoughts and everything about us, everything in our life. If there are things in our life that are taking more importance than God, we need to identify those things and make sure that we take them out of that position because no idol could ever stand up to God. In the judgment day, how silly will it be to have depended on other things when God is standing right there asking us to give account of our lives? And the only thing we can say is, yes, I gave my life to Jesus Christ, and I accept his offer of salvation. And yes, I became a Christian. Yes, I became a faithful Christian, and I trusted in you, God. I trusted in Jesus and his saving grace. Just by doing that, we have an awful lot of power, and that's more power than any idol could ever offer anybody. Those things will be destroyed just like all of matter. The whole world will go away in a fervent heat and a loud noise. And what will be left is the spirits that we are. And those spirits will go up to the judgment day. And we want to have that confidence. And we know we have that confidence if we live the life we ought to live, because Jesus died so that we could have that opportunity. So if there's anyone that would like to become a Christian to make that choice, we always offer this as a time. And if there's anyone who would like the prayers of the congregation for anything, this is also an invitation that's open for that. This is something to think about for us, and a very personal lesson to think about on your own terms and what it means to you. But thank you for your kind attention, and we'll stand and sing the song that's been selected.